Hi guys, in this episode I'm going to be talking about some very kind of core functions of cameras and lenses that really kind of create a very specific look that you're going for, that you might be going for within cinematography or even still imagery for that matter. But I'm going to be talking about this in relationship to motion photography, so basically cinematography. The three major things I'm going to be covering and defining in this are going to be depth of field, focal length, and shutter speed. I'm going to go into those things in depth, explain what they are, explain how you manipulate them, and what you get as a result of manipulating those three very core functions of a camera. So let's go ahead and get started.
First subject I want to cover is depth of field. Depth of field is, to put a definition on it, it's basically the area in front of your lens that is in acceptable, what we call quote acceptable sharpness. And if you're looking at this little diagram here, here's your camera lens here. We're looking at a profile of the camera, and in here will be the inside of your camera. And within the inside of your camera, in fact, I'm going to draw a little diagram here and kind of talk about that. In front of your lens, you're going to have a certain area that is in sharp focus. This is very similar to the way our eyes work with the lens inside of our eye here. And we also have an iris as well that opens up and lets a certain amount of light in inside of our eye. It is the lens inside of our eye. What happens is the lens, you have a muscle on top here and muscle on the bottom here, and it kind of pulls the lens to change this plane of focus here, or this depth of field. Basically it shifts it as it pulls that thing to make it more narrow or more thick. It changes where the focus moves. If you put your hand up really close to your face, the muscles are actually contracting and pulling the lens tighter, and you're focusing on something closer to your face, but then the background goes out of focus. Then if you remove your hand from the front of your face and you focus on something past that, those muscles relax and they focus on things far away. With a glass lens, this does not have the ability to change shape, basically, because it's made of hard glass, or in some instances hard plastic, clear plastic, but most instances hard glass there. And as that glass, so what they do basically to get it to change focus is taking light that is hitting this lens here and bending it and focusing it on what we call the film plane, or your digital sensor inside your camera. And it's focusing light. It's taking all this light flooding through the lens and focusing it on this plane right here. It comes to a point a certain distance away from the lens that's going to focus it on that plane that ends up recording it. And in your eye, it does the exact same thing. The light will hit this lens and bend and focus on the back of your eyeball here, in the back of your head, where the nerves pick that up and reinterpret the signal to an image. Now, in front of your eye, or the lens, you will have a certain area that is in sharp focus, and this depth here will change. Will either grow larger or grow smaller. And this depth of field can change here. It can get larger or it can get smaller. And we'll talk about the definitions or the terms they use to describe that as well. I want to kind of describe the way that basically works. So let's kind of go through the parts of a camera here and how that works. Basically, you have this lens that's like this concave piece of glass that basically bends the light and focuses it into the back of the camera. Then around that lens you'll have what's called a lens hood that kind of protects the lens, and it will actually in some instances move this lens slightly back and forth to be able to focus it. Since this glass can't bend, it slightly moves it back and forth to determine what is in focus in front of the camera. What amount of light is in focus in front of what amount of light it'll focus on the sensor in front of the camera. And then you will have behind that, inside the lens hood, you will have basically your iris. And this is an opening that allows a certain amount of light in. If you open this up more, it'll allow more light in, more exposure as we call it. If you stop it down, it will let less light in. So now we've got the camera box back here, and just a simple little lesson camera, if you're familiar with like the Latin or the Italian version of the word camera. Camera is actually a room. This is like a dark room back here, and that describes the camera. And inside that you will have a sensor that is sensitive to light, and as that light comes in, this flat chip here is what's going to be recording the actual in the case of a digital camera instead of a film camera. If you have film going through it, if you have like one of those motion picture film cameras with the Mickey Mouse ears on top, you got your unexposed film up here. It comes through, goes through like a series of gears where it like goes flat onto that plane, then it goes through another series of gears that like take it up in here. That's a beautiful illustration, by the way. And then the light will hit the lens, and this shape of the lens makes the light bend, go down through the iris, and it puts things on the top, on the bottom. And as light coming from the bottom hits the lens, it'll bend and hit the top. And you basically have an upside down image inside your camera here. And if you've got a digital camera, it flips it right side up. In fact, our eyes do this as well. We get the image recorded on the back of our retinas, cornea, I don't know what it is. I'm not a scientist or an ophthalmologist, whatever. Like I said, I'm not a doctor. So I'm a doctor of video instead. Yes, there we go. So as the light bends through, you get this upside down image on the back of your eye or inside the camera, and digitally with digital cameras, it flips it right side up. If you ever do this with a pinhole camera, you'll notice you're getting the images on the wall upside down from the outside or wherever you're recording. So we've got our lens, we've got our iris, and we've got our film plane back here. And this is essentially the way a camera works here. And you'll oftentimes have on your lens a little ring, if you got these manual lenses, a little ring on the outside of the lens. As you turn that ring, it will open up your iris or close your iris. So, all right, let's move on to depth of field now. So depth of field is essentially this area in front of the camera that is in sharp focus. There are several things that affect your depth of field. Let's talk about kind of the artistic interpretation of depth of field and what that causes, what that looks like in front of your camera. Here I've got kind of this crummy little image, but you'll see that things in the foreground look like they're soft or out of focus, and then you have this range that starts coming in focus right here, and then it starts coasting out of focus right about here. So this might be like about 5 feet in front of the camera, it comes in focus, and then about 8 to 10 feet away from the camera, it starts going out of focus. So you got a range, I'm guessing, I don't know, like about 5 feet, between 5 feet and 9 feet. So your depth of field is about 4 feet. And you'll also have what's called a focal plane. That is the absolute sharpest point of focus right there. And then you'll have a distance in front of that focal plane and a distance behind that focal plane that is in focus. So with this image, the focal plane is likely right about here. If it's like, let's say it's in focus from 4 feet to 9 feet, your focal plane will probably be in focus about, the focal plane will probably be about around like 5 or 6 feet. You'll have less in focus in front of the focal plane than you do behind it. You'll have more depth of field behind it and less depth of field in front of it between this and the camera, because as you get closer to the camera, your depth of field decreases. As you start grabbing that focal ring and on your lens and changing it to bring something in focus closer to the camera, this depth of field is going to shrink. These are two important terms to know here. One is shallow and one is deep. That looks more like peep. That's actually deep, believe me. There we go. Deep and shallow. Depth of field grows smaller and smaller. We call it shallow. As it grows larger and larger, we call it deep. This is very similar to a swimming pool. If you have a swimming pool, you can look at this. Let's draw a rudimentary swimming pool here. And you have a little bit of depth of field from here to here, right there, not very much. We call that shallow. If you have a lot of depth of field, we call that, nice straight line, we call that deep. So if I'm using those two general terms here, I'm going to be describing that if you open up your depth of field, it becomes deeper. If you drop it down, or if you bring it down, it becomes shallow. So that's quite enough explanation there. But what we get as a result here is, with this, trying to control your depth of field, what this does psychologically is it draws your attention to the portion that is in focus. Now let's look at this image right here. You look at these things that are in the background. Most people will initially look at the item in focus right here psychologically. So this is a way of manipulating the audience. This is a way of manipulating what we want people to look at, is by changing your depth of field. If this was like your phone camera that you're using, phone cameras tend to have a very deep depth of field, which means almost everything is in focus unless it gets really close to the camera. We are using that depth of field to manipulate where the audience is looking. If this was all in focus, you'd look wherever. Right now, we tend to look at this face right there. Let's talk about things that change your depth of field. One thing that I mentioned was distance already, but I'm going to mention 1, 2, 3, 4 different items that change your depth of field. And the first one that I did mention was distance. Let's talk about how this affects your depth of field. I'm going to be talking about this in relationship to the two terms that I brought up, deep and shallow. Distance. Let's talk about distance. First of all, distance, as we mentioned, if we've got a camera here, there's our lens, there's our body, beautiful illustration. As things get closer to the camera, your depth of field will shrink. The closer you get to the lens, and it's the same, the physics in our eye as well, as you get things closer and closer to your eye and you focus on things really close by, your depth of field becomes more shallow. As you get further away, so we've got this little depth of field right here. As you get further away, your depth of field will increase. It will get deeper and deeper and deeper the further you get away. In fact, some cameras, when you get an object like up to 10 feet away, it'll be in focus from like 10 feet to infinity. When you get it down to like 3 feet or 1 foot in front of the camera, then it will shrink down to maybe like anywhere from 6 inches to a foot of depth of field. So as things get closer, they become more shallow. As they get further away, they become more deep, the depth of field. Items that are in focus, essentially. 2, and we will talk about this coming up here, but we're going to talk about what's called focal length. Focal length is your lens here. It's basically your zoom. It's how far that lens is away from the camera. That's our little plane sensor in there. We will describe this so when we get into the focal length portion of my lesson here. So focal length will affect it as well. And basically, I'll tell you right now, as your focal length increases, as you zoom out, your depth of field decreases. As your focal length decreases, your depth of field increases. There we go. So the wider angle you have, the more depth of field, the more telephoto length, the less depth of field you have. And we'll show some examples of that when we get into the focal length section. 3rd, and this is a big one as well, is your iris or your aperture. Your iris or your aperture, basically your aperture, let's describe the difference between iris and aperture. Your iris is essentially this right here. This is looking right inside the lens. Through the glass, you'll see this physical mechanism that opens and closes. These little shields spread out and open up your iris more or close it. And this physical mechanism is called your iris. Now, your aperture is something a little bit different. It is this distance in here. The distance is basically the diameter of this opening right here. It's how far this opening is across. If we look at a circle, this is a perfect circle, by the way, and you got 3 different things. You have the distance going around your circle. The distance going around your circle is, anyone? You're right, your circumference. And if you go from the very middle point on out, that is called your radius. And if you go from one side to the other on an equal circle there, so it's this maximum size line that you can fit within that circle, that is your diameter. And that distance measured in millimeters is your aperture size. So your aperture or your iris, basically your iris opening up and causing a different aperture, is going to change your depth of field. And this is the exact same thing that's in our eyes. The iris in our eye, as it opens up and you get a larger iris, or you get a larger aperture as opposed to a small aperture. So remember this, as this opens up really, really wide, your depth of field shrinks. Your depth of field becomes more shallow. So this one here is shallow, and as your eye stops down, when there's plenty of light and your eye stops down and you've got this very small aperture, this one you're going to have deep. So when there's a lot of light, you have a lot of depth of field. When there's very little light, you have a shallow depth of field. So your iris opens up, your aperture opens up, shallow depth of field. When it stops down, deep depth of field. And this is one of the main functions that cinematographers use to really manipulate their depth of field. When they want a certain specific depth of field, they will manipulate their iris usually, and then provide the amount of light necessary to expose the shot. 4, sensor size. Depending on the size of the film that you're using or the size of your sensor, you will have more depth of field with a larger sensor. If you have a large sensor, in fact, if we talk about like a 35 millimeter sensor versus what we would call versus what we would call an approximate 16 millimeter sensor. This is going to exaggerate depth of field. You're putting that depth of field over a larger area, and you're going to have less depth of field with a 35 millimeter sensor versus a 16 millimeter sensor. In fact, some of the micro sensors that you have, like in your phone or in home video cameras, they're small for a reason. The reason why they're small is because they're going to be consumers using it, and they want their footage to all be in focus. The smaller sensor you have, you're going to have an enormous depth of field, and it's going to be very, very deep. Almost everything is going to be in focus unless it gets really, really close to the camera and it goes into macro mode. Then this is going to get a huge depth of field, and this is going to start narrowing your depth of field. In fact, as they go from 35 millimeter film, which is pretty standard, to 70 millimeter film, the depth of field even it goes way more shallow when you go to the 70 millimeter film. So they got to be a little bit more careful about how fast their lenses are when they're exposing their shots. Anyway, so just something to be aware of. This one you usually can't control that much. If your camera already has a built-in sensor that is a certain size, like a Canon 7D has about a 16 millimeter sensor, and the Canon 5D will have a 35 millimeter sensor. This is very standard for most lenses, and if you're using the same lenses that you're using on a 5D that you use on a 7D, in fact the 7D will crop a portion of that 35 image, and you'll just get this portion of your image and it'll look like it's zooming up a little bit. So this is usually that's why people usually like the 5Ds over the 7Ds, or the 5Ds over the T3Is or T5Is or whatever. But these are the main items that affect your depth of field, and I've explained how each one, distance, focal length, iris, and sensor size, are different ways of controlling your depth of field. Now that that's explained, let's look at a couple shots here. Now watch what happens here is we've got, look at this, we've got an aperture of f1.8. The way this aperture, this f1.8 works right here, f1.8 is your f-stop. Basically what that works is it comes from an equation. Let's describe focal length really quick. Focal length is the distance from your lens to your image sensor, and that's measured in millimeters, and it's actually the optical center of your lens. It's where the light actually hits and starts bending. It'll be the distance from that exact point to the image sensor or the film plane in your camera, and that distance is measured in millimeters. Let's say we've got 50 millimeters distance between that focal length and your image sensor. Now your iris or your aperture is going to be a very specific size. Let's say it's going to be about that big. Let's say that's about 10 millimeters right there. Now we're going to say, so that is our aperture size. It's in here, of course. It's like your aperture right there. That's that distance right there. So that's your aperture size. And let's say that's about 10 millimeters. You got 50 millimeters and 10 millimeters. Where they get the f-stop is they say, how many times can I fit that iris within my focal length? And this circle looks like it's probably going to hit, I'm guessing here, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's going to fit like 7 times within that 50 millimeter. What we got is a 7.0 f-stop. So what we're going to end up with is f7.0. That is our f-stop. That means you can fit that aperture 7 times within your focal length. Now, say we've got something wider like this there. Let's see, that's a bigger hole. We're going to go, I'm going to guess here, 1, 2, 3, 3.5, let's say. That's going to be basically a 3.5. If it's really, really big like that, it's like you can fit it 1, 2 times. That gives us a 2.0. So look at this, 2.0 versus 3.5 versus 7.0 right there. What does that tell you about your f-stop? The lower the number, the larger the aperture. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture. So keep that in mind. But that's where that f-stop number comes from, is from that distance there. And basically what we're doing there to get that equation is we are dividing the focal length. Let's go to this. We're going to do focal length is divided by aperture. And basically that gives you your f-stop right there. So focal length, we've got 50 divided by 10. That is actually going to be an f-stop of 5.0 right there. So that's where it's getting. It's how many times you can fit that aperture size within your focal length, and that gives you your f-stop. Our f-stop, ignore the shutter speed right now because we don't have any movement here, so that's just to compensate for different exposures here with different f-stops, with different amount of light that's coming in here. But as we open up, we change our shutter speed to compensate and get a good exposure. But we've got aperture f8, aperture 1.8. So this is a very open aperture. This is kind of closed aperture here. And look at the difference here with your depth of field. This is still out of focus. It's considered out of focus, but notice here it becomes more muddy. So you get this is called more muddy here. So this is still out of focus, but this is very, very much out of focus here. So as you open up your iris, you get more of a muddy feel here on the background. And what this does with the audience, it manipulates kind of the psyche to look at these, the psychological effect that this has, even when this is out of focus, but this is even more out of focus, is we're concentrating and dwelling more on this image in focus than we are here. Here you might look at this and kind of look at the background, but here you are just forced to look at this. And that's really where your concentration, that's how you tell, that is how you manipulate people. That's how you basically tell stories using the depth of field artistically. Okay, now we're on to focal length. As I described before, focal length is essentially you have your lens, have your optical center of the lens where the light starts to bend. It's not necessarily right in the middle of the lens, but it's where the light starts to bend. That is considered your optical center. So we've got our lens hood here. We've got our iris inside here. Oh, that's not even, I don't care. You got your camera, you got your image plane back here, and you got your image, going through here and giving that upside down image on your film plane back here. So your focal length is this distance right here between the optical center of the lens and your image plane. Oftentimes you will see a little mark on your camera that's like this, a circle with a line through it. If you look for that on your camera, that is where, and on this camera here, you would see a circle on the outside body with a line through it. That is basically, this line here is exactly right where your sensor is. So if you need to measure things with a tape, with a measuring tape, you can do that, and you will have an accurate distance between this and a subject. Tells you where you're in focus on that lens. Then now that lens will have some markings on it. It'll say like 5 feet and 6 inches. From this point here, not from the lens, but from back here to that subject, or to this right here, 5 foot 6 feet inches out in front of the camera, you will have sharp, that is where your focal plane is, right there, exactly at that point. But then you'll have some depth of field and focus in front of it, some depth of field even more behind it, and you've got your depth of field right there. So that 5.6 on your lens is in focus from your image plane here on the camera to this exact point, 5.6 feet. As long as your camera's calibrated properly and your back focus is set properly, you can rely on that. And they do with most cinema lenses. They will use a tape measure to measure from the subject to the camera just to make sure that they are in sharp focus, especially with film. That's very, very important. So that focal length there. Now, what happens with focal length is a couple things. Focal length affects, actually, we'll say 3 things here. And I kind of like to say it kind of compresses 3 things, even though that's not really accurate, but it helps me remember it. Compresses 3 things. First of all, image. The amount of image that you are seeing. When you change your focal length, you are affecting the amount of image that you're seeing. Depth of field. You're changing your depth of field. As you change focal length, as you increase or decrease focal length, you're changing your depth of field. You're either shrinking your depth of field or opening or making it deeper, making it more shallow or deep. And lastly, space. You are flattening space. You're kind of killing depth perception by changing your focal length. Let's talk about each one of these. First of all, image. We'll talk about image. Okay, image. Amount of image that you see. We've got a lens here. We've got our camera. As you take this lens and you have 2 different types of lenses. You have prime lenses, 2 basic types of lenses, prime lenses and variable focal length lenses, or zoom lenses. Zoom. So zoom lenses. Prime lens is one that has a set focal length. Means you either have one, let's say this distance here is 50 millimeters. 50 millimeters prime means that thing does not move. It's set right there and is optimized for bringing in a certain amount of light where you can really get a good depth of field using a prime lens. If you're not worried so much about the depth of field, you can use a variable focal length lens. That means the lens can physically travel within the lens housing and go further away from the camera or closer to the camera. And oftentimes on zoom lenses, you will see it will say something like this lens is an 18 to 100 or something like that. That means it can zoom from 18, it'll go 18 millimeters wide to 100 millimeters telephoto. So 50 millimeters means it's 50 millimeters away. Let's say this here is a 25 millimeter lens. That's 25 millimeters away. And let's say this is an 85 millimeter lens right here. That is 85 millimeters away. Now what happens as you increase or decrease your focal length is this. 18 millimeter. Lens is close to the camera. You have very wide shot of very wide perspective of this image here. Now look what happens as we go all the way from the 24, 35, moving on up the line here to 300. This is one of these little barns here. Now you're seeing a nice tight close-up shot. This thing is traveling further away from the camera, and you are getting closer to the image. As it gets further away from the camera, you're going more telephoto. The way this kind of works physically is it's almost like it being inside of a cave. This is a cave, or let's say a train tunnel or something like that. So this is the entrance right here, and you are standing down here, and you have very short legs. You have a big tree out here, and let's say proportionally, let's say you are a lot further away, but let's say proportionally you are 100 millimeters away. Well, we could even say 100 meters, but proportional with a lens. Compared to right here, which might be like 10 millimeters away, or 10 meters away, we could say. So 10 millimeters away. So right here, close, what you're going to end up seeing is a wider perspective of items. Further down the tunnel, you're going to see a more narrow perspective. So this here is called telephoto. This is considered a telephoto lens. Anything past 50 millimeters in cinematography, at least 50 millimeters is considered a standard lens for a lot of close-ups and medium shots. 50 millimeters is considered a standard lens. Anything below that, going below that, is going to be considered wide. In just general terms, that's going to be considered wide. Anything past 50 millimeters is going to be considered telephoto. And a lens, once again, that travels and does it's called a variable focal length lens, and that is basically a zoom lens. And your phones typically do not have a zoom lens. There's some special phones that do, but most phones do not. They have a digital zoom. The digital zoom is bad because as you digitally zoom, as you pinch zoom, it just decreases your quality instead of an optical zoom. An optical zoom is this where the lens is traveling and it maintains quality. This does not. Your phones, when you zoom, sorry people, it's decreasing your quality, decreasing your resolution. It looks like crap. Optical resolution or optical zooming is a way to go, an actual physical lens. And there are some Samsung phones that do that. You can look them up. Very cool phones, and big bulky ones, but they actually do it, and they're cool phones. Next one that focal length changes is depth of field. There we go. You can see that very clearly. Depth of field. What happens as your lens travels, and this is one thing that doesn't match our eyes. Our eyes have prime lenses. They do not have variable focal length lenses. But as your lens changes from closer to wider, let's say from more telephoto to wide, with telephoto, your depth of field, as you get more telephoto, your depth of field becomes more shallow. As your lens gets closer to the camera and you go more wide angle is going to have deep depth of field. As you're compressing the image, you're compressing the amount of depth of field as well. So as you're compressing the amount of image that you're seeing, your depth of field shrinks. And lastly, and I'm going to show some examples of this, space compression. You basically, as your lens zooms out, as your focal length increases, depth perception decreases. It looks like an object that might be, here's an object here, let's say there's a person standing here and a person standing here. As you zoom in, it looks like these people get closer and closer together. If you ever look up, just go on Google, type in Zoom Dolly, Lord of the Rings, or Jaws, and you'll see a whole bunch of different types of shots that happen when they're physically moving the camera closer to a subject while zooming out. You get the space compression, you see the stretch happening, or vice versa, as they're backing the camera up while zooming in with the lens at the same time. You get the space compression happening. It looks like things are stretching or flattening, and it's kind of a cool effect. It's called the Zoom Dolly. They call it Zolly. That's kind of a stupid name, but that's what some people call it. But look that up on Google and you'll see some instances of that happening. Let's show some pictures really quick. So this is with focal length. This is the first thing that we said it affects, is cropping. It's not really cropping, but it's compressing the amount of image that you're basically able to see physically at wide angle, telephoto, and around 50 millimeters standard. Depth of field. This lens here is probably like at 100 millimeters, so it's a telephoto lens punched in on this girl here. You see the background out of focus, the foreground out of focus, and she is in sharp focus. And what this does, once again, with the audience's attention, is draws the look right here to her face. The story is right here, and possibly a little bit of what she's looking at, but that is the story. That's what we're being forced to look at. You can see a difference here as this flower at 60 millimeter and then the camera actually is backed up further here and zoomed in to get the exact same framing. So here the camera's actually physically closer to the flower. Here it's further away but zoomed in, and look at the background once again. It's more muddy over here. You're getting similar f-stop, so the f-stop's not affecting that, but from 60 millimeter to 180 millimeter, and you're getting less depth of field as a result, a more shallow depth of field as a result. Here is space compression here. As this camera is backed way up and zoomed in on maybe like a 300 millimeter lens or more, it looks like these stores are just like compact, just like one right after the other after the other. This is space compression here. It is, as you zoom into something, you punch in, you get a higher focal length. Your space compression is way exaggerated. It's hard to tell the distance between objects. Depth perception is killed. In fact, look at this: 18 millimeter versus 55 millimeter. 18 millimeter gives more of a true sense of the depth between these bottles. 55 millimeter looks like they're right next to it. In fact, in Lord of the Rings, with a lot of the hobbits versus like the tall people, they did a lot of forced perspective shots. In fact, look up forced perspective on Google and Lord of the Rings. It has a nice little making of video that shows, because this illusion is destroyed when you move the camera. In fact, if you look up forced perspective on Google, you're going to get a ton of images that make it look like this is closer to the camera, this is further away, and you get this image of somebody stepping on somebody else. These are all these self-flats images of forced perspective. Look at that right there. There's got to be some Photoshop manipulation here, though. I don't know, maybe it's not. But look at that. You get forced perspective where it looks like somebody's holding the balloon. Big one is Tower of Pisa. Tower of Pisa, you're going to get all these dorks. In fact, I did this when I was in Italy as well, so I'm one of these dorks that look like, see, these people are close to the camera, and it looks like they're holding up the tower. So everybody does this, makes it look like they're holding the tower. In fact, there's some of these images where if you move the camera, it destroys the illusion. In fact, look at all these idiots here acting like they're holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and when the camera is moved, it destroys the perspective. So there's this really cool stuff they do with Lord of the Rings, where they're moving the camera, they're actually moving the background to keep maintaining the perspective, and it makes it look like the person is smaller than they actually are. Look it up. Great stuff. Great example of forced perspective being used practically to tell a story and manipulate and tell the story the way they want to tell a story. A couple more examples here. This is, it looks like this guy back here that's out of focus. That's the only reason we can tell that he's probably behind the railing, because he's out of focus, but it almost looks like he's sitting on the back of this car right here, and these cars look so compact together because this is a telephoto lens zooming in. There's a wide angle lens, and you can really gauge how far apart these people are from the buildings. You get a real sense of perspective here with a wider angle lens. So that's a wide angle lens, that's a telephoto lens. All right, let's talk about shutter speed. So last thing I want to talk about is shutter speed. Shutter speed is essentially exposure time, and this affects two major things here. First of all, obviously, your exposure, that's how much light, or it's not how much light is coming in. How much light is determined by your f-stop. Your f-stop or your aperture determines how much light is being let in, but shutter speed is specifically exposure time. This is, so I'm just going to put exposure time. It's how long this amount of light is being let in for exposing an individual frame. So you have one frame here, you basically have a physical shutter that blocks that thing out. This is my shutter, and as you push the button on your still camera, this shutter lifts up and it exposes this frame with light, and then it closes. And the length of time that it does that in is called your shutter speed. That's how long you're exposing every individual frame. If you're doing motion picture, basically you're exposing, if you're shooting, let's say you're shooting film, you're shooting 24 frames per second. That means you can expose every single frame within a second here. You can expose every single frame for a maximum of 1/24th of a second. If you're set at maximum exposure time per frame, 1/24th of a second for motion photography, this is your shutter speed. That's not very standard for film. Film shoots usually half exposure time. Half of 1/24th is going to be 1/48th. 1/48th of a second. Every frame usually in film as a standard is exposed for 1/48th of a second. This really goes back to the days of the rolling shutter, which is still being used in film cameras, where you have basically your film frame here and you have this shutter that's rolling. This is a darkened out plate that basically rolls and blocks out the film for half the time and exposes it for half the time with this rolling shutter. If you ever hear that, it's the same thing as shutter speed, essentially, how long you're exposing each frame for, but it's doing it with a physical rolling shutter mechanism. It's like this half circle that rolls and shuts it off and exposes, because the reason why they did that is because whenever this wheel would block off the image, they had to change the film. You have this film strip going through the camera that would bring the next frame down. The next frame would move down, and then it would expose that frame, and then the next frame would move down, and it would expose that frame, and so on and so forth. And that's really where the half exposure time comes from. It also happens to be that we see what is called motion blur about at the same rate as half exposure time. Half exposure time causes kind of the standard motion blur effect. So let's think about this. If you open up your shutter, and let's say we have our frame here, nice perfect square frame, and you have a fly buzzing through your picture that you're videotaping, a bee or a fly or something. This fly in, let's say, 1/48th of a second is moving so fast it moves from here to here in 1/48th of a second. On that one frame, what you're going to do is get a streak, a motion blur. Basically, this fly can be in focus, but this is going to look like a streak going from here to here in 1/48th of a second. If you increase your shutter speed and you get, and that fly, let's say we're moving it, let's go really extreme, 1/1000th of a second. It opens up only for 1/1000th of a second. In 1/1000th of a second, the fly travels from here to there in 1/1000th of a second. Basically, you're going to get less motion blur, and it's going to look very nice and crisp. So you're going to get the kind of this crisp look with shutter speed. In fact, I'm going to show a video right here. With this video here, so here's kind of a visual example of shutter speed changes here. With this first clip here, as we play through it, you'll see the hand looks, he's moving his hand really quickly, so we're going to have a little bit of motion blur. If we pause this is at 1/48th of actually 1/50th on a DSLR camera here, so it's about half exposure time. And with half exposure time, we've got, and for that half exposure time, when there's quick movement, we stop it on a still frame, and you have some motion blur there, and it looks like the hand is blurring. But with the higher shutter speed, look at the differences. We see him shaking his hands here, and we stop it on a still frame. You see his hand is way more crisp than it was initially, with a shutter speed of about 1/300th of a second here. But as we play the half exposure time, the lower shutter speed, it just kind of naturally looks like normal motion blur, just kind of natural movement. And then if you play the higher shutter speed clip here, watch closely. In movement here, it looks like it's just a little bit more choppy or something. I'm not sure how to describe that, but it has a different visual look. So basically, with high shutter speed, you're going to get these really crisp images. And in fact, they use a higher shutter speed for scenes like Saving Private Ryan or Gladiator during the battle scenes, because usually when people's adrenaline picks up, things come into finer focus and they're sharper, and psychologically they're trying to create that effect with shutter speed within fight scenes. Otherwise, they typically use 1/48th half exposure time, but then they'll crank it up to 196. You can go 196 times 2. You can even crank that up to like 192 second, 192th of a second. I don't know what to call that. Anyway, fraction of a second there, to get a very sharp shutter speed as opposed to kind of this motion blur. In fact, so the two things that shutter speed is affecting is your exposure. So if you expose it for longer, you will get brighter more, can get potentially, and if you're doing a lower shutter speed, you're going to get more exposure and you're going to get a brighter image, and that could be overexposed. Sometimes people outside, if they're want a lower shutter speed, they will put ND in front of the lens, so they still get natural motion blur. But look at this guy looks like he's just standing in air with a higher shutter speed, and the motion blur here as he jumps while the shutter's open, it causes motion blur. The lower the shutter speed, the more motion blur you're going to get. The higher shutter speed, the less motion blur you're going to get. In fact, look at these two images. A higher shutter speed at 1/350th here, looks like the bat is holding still. At 1/180th, a lower shutter speed, you get some motion blur going across the bat. So once again, exposure. And still photographers oftentimes use higher shutter speed just to get a nice sharp image, but motion cinematographers will use oftentimes a 1/48th, and they will use ND in front of the lens to darken the amount of light coming in, but so they can get the shutter speed look and the motion blur look that they want. Here's the low shutter speed. It looks like this guy is in motion, and he is, because the background has motion blur and he is in focus. And there you go. There's a low shutter speed versus a high shutter speed. And look at this, a very high shutter speed. This might be 1/3000th 1/3000th of a second here, you get these drops of water coming out of the faucet that look like they're suspended in air as a result, and very little to no motion blur on those droplets of water from a very high shutter speed. Those are the major items I kind of want to talk about. We had depth of field with lenses, we have focal length on lenses, and your aperture that is actually controlled inside the camera. With those three things right there, we kind of discuss what those the sort of psychological effects of changing your depth of field, of changing your focal length, and changing your aperture give you. You can kind of decide how you want to use those as an artist. Like I said, if you're going to be changing your iris and opening up your iris to get a very narrow depth of field, then you're going to have to sometimes use less light or ND filters in front of your camera. Same with aperture. If you're doing a higher shutter speed outside or inside, it might even darken your image so much that you have to use extra lights. So if you're just shooting a movie, those are some things to keep in mind. If you have any questions or comments, please post them, and thanks for watching.